Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ark Telos Saint Amor. It's a long name, so most folks call me Tay. My mandatory pronouns are they, them, there, and I'm the executive director of Youth Move National. I legit could not be more excited about today's session. My dear friend is here, and so I'm so excited to get started. But first, if you've been in any sessions yet, you know we've got some housekeeping items to go through. So the first thing is I just really want to remind everyone that we're trying to cultivate a safe, brave, and accountable, emphasis on that accountable, space for y'all today. So just kind of keep that in mind. Make sure we slow down, prime with intention, right? Lead with good intention, be kind. And you can read actually that statement. If you go back into the reception area, you can kind of read that accountability statement there. So just want to remind folks, please, we're really going to try to create that space together today. Secondly, I hope that this isn't your first session today, but if it is, welcome. But you have a vertical toolbar to the right hand. There it is, to the right hand side of your screen. And if you can't see it, you may have another window open, X out on it, and then you should see your vertical toolbar. In there, you should see 4 little boxes, the first icon, but then the one down, which is pretty important, is the chat box. So if you want to have that open, I see folks sending gifts already. I've been loving y'all's gifts all day. So it looks like you know where the chat box is. Possibly more important than even the chat box is the section below it, which is the Q&A section. So I know folks can raise their hands, but unfortunately we're not going to be able to call to folks. The chat, I'm watching it in real time, is already moving super fast. So we just are really encouraging you, instead of raising your hand, instead of putting your question in the chat box, please just formally put it into the Q&A section. That will really help us stay organized and make sure that we can get to your questions. Lastly, really just want to remind folks of the wellness room and that we're really here to welcome you how you are, where you are, right? So if you need to step away, bio break, get some water, stay hydrated, make sure you're drinking water. This is your daily reminder. And if you just need a break, decompress, we have our wellness room. So that should be on your up left corner there. And if you click that, there will be a staff member who will come in and help you. You can watch some also animal cams on the breaks. I've been watching some jellyfish, so that's pretty cool. So that is available to you. Okay, enough of me talking. I want to get into it. I want to welcome y'all to Let's Spread Queer Joy. Yes, I'm here for it. How to cultivate queer and gender affirming environments for the people in our lives. This is my absolute pleasure to introduce y'all to Lindz and Teddy. I hope Teddy's going to make an appearance. Lindz makes queer stuff for kids. They are a multi-hyphenate author, educator, performer, and activist bringing LGBTQ plus edutainment. I think I got that right. Combination of education and entertainment. Education, edutainment. There it is for families. And again, dear friend and a fan. So, Lindz and Teddy, I welcome y'all to the stage. Thank you for being here.
Goodness, what an introduction. Thank you so much, Tay. And thank you all for hyping it up in the comments. I'm loving these gifts. And I'm also loving everybody dropping their location. I saw Maryland and Kentucky and Texas and Seattle. And oh my gosh, fantastic. I love how many people are here and how many people are here from so many different places. And I'm sure we have lots of different kinds of folks here with us today. And again, my name is Lindz, and this is my friend Teddy who's joining me today. And we are collectively, let me share my screen to get that timing on. We're from Queer Kid Stuff. And I did happen to bring my ukulele with me today, so we could start off with a song. Here we go. It's okay to be gay. We are different in many ways. Doesn't matter if you're a boy, girl, or somewhere in between. We all are part of one big family. Gay means happy. Queer kid stuff. you are enough here at Queer Kid Stuff. There we go. I thought we would just start with a little song right there. There we go. Excellent. All right. Here we go. All right. So, thank you in the chat. Everyone's so kind. All right. So, queer kid stuff. Let's spread queer joy. We're going to talk about how we cultivate queer and gender affirming environments for youth and for young people. But before we get there, you need to know a little bit more about who I am. Hi, everybody. My name is Lindz. I use they, them pronouns. I identify as trans, non binary, and queer. A couple of other words that I use for myself are white and Jewish and neurodivergent. I'm also an author. You can see my two books here and maybe behind me Rainbow Parenting, Your Guide to Raising Queer Kids and Their Allies, and my picture book, Hooray for She, He, Z, and They. I'm also a screenwriter. I do work in mainstream children's media, specifically preschool. You might have seen my work. I helped on the Pride music video that Nina West was a part of for Blues Clues and You. And I also wrote the first non binary character in the Paw Patrol universe. So that's a little bit of my work in this in the mainstream kind of preschool world. I'm a performer, I'm an educator, I teach preschool music and after school drama, and I'm in a lot of educational spaces. I'm actually teaching, I figured this out the other day. I'm right now in my classes that I'm teaching, I'm working with all ages from 0 through 11-year-olds, which is kind of a wild age range to be working with. Not a lot of folks are kind of doing that wide of a range, which is incredible. I'm really, really loving it. And then my recent picture book, Hooray for She, He, Z, and They, from Simon and Schuster, that came out late February. But most people know me for my web series called Queer Kid Stuff, where I bring everything that you loved about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Sesame Street and all those iconic kids shows, preschool shows that you might have been watching when you were young or with your kids today. And I took everything that I learned in Queer Theory 101 and I kind of mushed them together. And that's how I came up with Queer Kid Stuff. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how, through all of my work, but especially through Queer Kid Stuff, we're doing something called spreading queer joy. And now, before we get into like actually how we do that, I want to talk a little bit about why we do this. Why is this important? Why should we care? Right? So I'm going to throw some facts and statistics at you, just a little bit of a content warning. Some of these are maybe a little bit of upsetting, but these are really important kind of contexts to understand why this is such urgent and important work, and because it literally saved lives. So, this is a statistic from a Gallup study, and this is kind of gets updated pretty frequently. This number that 1 in 5 Gen Z youth identify as LGBTQ+. And that is, I believe it's a little bit more than that, actually. There was a study that came out, I think an update on this that came out maybe a couple of weeks ago, actually, that it's actually a little bit, that the rate is a little bit higher, just like a touch. But 1 in 5 Gen Z youth identify as LGBTQ+. And this is the generation with the highest rates of young people who are identifying as LGBTQ+. And anecdotally speaking, I have seen some numbers kind of behind the scenes on Gen Alpha, but also just like through personal experience, Gen Alpha is definitely going to be even higher rates than this, like 100% sure about that. Again, anecdotal, but so we see this statistic, we see this 1 in 5 statistic. We know anecdotally that that Gen Alpha is probably going to be higher. And yet most adults still assume that the children in their lives will grow up to be cisgender and heterosexual. Now, I don't think this is grown-ups' fault. I think that this is the world that we are living in today, right? This is the society that we've all been born into. Most of us didn't have access to the possibility of queerness when we were that age, right? When we were young people. When we're talking about preschool, when we're talking about even just education in our elementary schools, even in middle and high school, right? So we have this 1 in 5 Gen Z identifying as LGBTQ+, but we're still assuming that young people will grow up to be cisgender and heterosexual. Because statistically impossible, right? That every young person will grow up to be cisgender and heterosexual. We've seen that from that 1 in 5 number, right? So let's do a little math problem together. If there are any stats or probability people in the audience today, let us know in the chat. This is a little bit of a question for you. Um, and I want to know, if we have this number, 1 in 5 Gen Z identify as LGBTQ plus. We have that number, 1 in 5, right? And then let's introduce another number. There's this kind of commonly understood idea. This is very extremely kind of like averaging out, very simplistic, but this kind of common idea that the average family in the United States will have 2.5 children. Now, I know there's no such thing as as zero point 0.5 of a child, but let's go with that number for the moment. So we have 1 in 5, and we have 2.5 children in a family. Now, I want to know, what is the probability that any family might have at least one young person in it that will turn out to be LGBTQ plus? That's kind of like the math problem, the probability problem I want to pose to you right now. If we have 1 in 5 young people in Gen Z who identify as LGBTQ plus, and we have families that have 2.5 kids, what is the probability that even just one young person in one family might turn out to be LGBTQ plus? Exactly, I'm seeing it in the chat. We're getting about a 50%. Yeah, 45, 30. Usually, the number that I hear is kind of around that, like, 50-ish percent number, and I know the probabilities and statistics are, like, a little bit more complicated than this math problem, but let's go with this. It's about half and half that you're gonna have at least one child in your family that identifies as LGBTQ+ at some point in their life. So, if we have that statistic, that 50% chance that even just one child in your family is going to be LGBTQ plus at some point in their life, right? They might identify as LGBTQ plus at some point in your life, right? Then it's not that hard, and we're still making that assumption that they're gonna grow up to be cisgender and heterosexual, right? Then it's not too hard to understand this statistic from the Trevor Project, that the LGBTQ plus youth are more than 4 times as likely to attempt suicide than their peers. And, this is from the Trevor Project's national survey. They just released, a new one in 2024, and this really, really rich, robust research that they put out, that LGBTQ plus youth are more than 4 times as likely to attempt suicide than their peers. And this is a number that really hasn't changed a whole lot, right? So, I do want to tell you that there is hope. Because that same Trevor Project report has found that trans and non-binary youth who report having their pronouns respected by even one person in their life attempted suicide at half the rate as the other trans and non-binary youth who they surveyed. Half the rate. This is the one thing that actually is shifting that statistic, that LGBTQ plus youth are 4 times as likely to attempt suicide. Respecting their pronouns and having a space where they're affirmed in their gender, in their identity, cuts that rate in half. And that's pretty startling. That's a pretty big number, right? And, I get this question a lot of like, why am I talking about these topics at such a young age, right? But I want to tell you that the American Academy of Pediatrics has actually found that most children have a solid understanding of their gender identity by the age of 4. So I'm not just talking about creating these affirming environments for teenagers and tweens, right? I'm talking as young as they come, right? I'm talking womb to tomb. I'm talking as soon as a child comes into our world, even before, right? We need to be cultivating queer and gender affirming environments for them, because we don't want to get to a point where where that mental health, you know, block, that issue, that mental health is becoming such a challenge that they are having suicidal ideation, right? So we don't want to get to the point where we're having to essentially do triage, essentially having to do work to mitigate what's already ingrained in their minds, right? In their young, impressionable minds. And we want to get in at a young age and affirm and show them who they can be as soon as they come into our world, right? So, this is me. This is me as a kid. I'm probably about 4 or 5 in this photo, and I look at this photo and I see my most authentic self. I had a tough teenage year, right? I had a tough time as an adolescent. I was really confused. I didn't know who I was. I was misgendered a lot as a child, and I didn't like that. It was uncomfortable for me. I didn't know how to advocate for myself. I didn't know what words I wanted to use for myself, what words felt good. And I had a lot of trouble with the fact that like I couldn't control how people perceived me. And so I remember asking my mom to get my ears pierced and to grow my hair long. And I kind of left this smile, right? Like this kid. I left that kid behind and I tried to please people around me. And it led to a lot of confusion and depression in my teen years. And honestly, a big reason why I'm not part of these statistics is because I was lucky and I had privilege and I had access, right? I got into a college that I wanted to go to, and that was my light at the end of the tunnel that got me through my teen years. And if I hadn't had that, I don't fully know if I would be here today. And so I look at this photo and I see my most authentic self, and that is the version of myself I've essentially been trying to chase ever since I said goodbye to them. And I feel finally now in my early 30s, after having gender affirming surgery and pursuing this work and pursuing my goals and my dreams and coming into my authentic self, I've really been able to revisit this version of myself and heal this inner child, right? So, when I'm talking about spreading queer joy and I'm talking about doing this work for young people, I'm also talking about doing it not just for kids, but for kids at heart too. So, this is something that I get feedback on a lot about my work of that it's grown-ups will come to my story times with their kids and they'll say, "Yeah, my kids are having a great time, but actually this felt so healing for my own inner child." So, I think that the benefits of spreading queer joy are absolutely for the young people in our lives, but it's also for the grown-ups around us. This is all ages work, and it is absolutely urgent, and it's life-saving. So the answer to our why is that queer and gender affirming environments for young people and really for everyone literally save lives, and that is research and statistically proven. All right. Whew, now we've got that why out of the way. Let's move on to how. How do we actually spread queer joy? And I'm going to just share with you like a couple of things that I use and tools that I use to make this happen. And you don't have to be a performer, right? You don't have to play ukulele. You don't have to have a teddy bear co-host of a web series in order to do this. This is stuff you can do in your everyday life, and it just has to do with getting over the mindset obstacles. It has to do with figuring out, okay, maybe I'm LGBTQ plus, maybe I identify as queer myself, but I'm not an expert in early childhood. I'm not an expert in early childhood techniques. How do I take these topics that I wasn't taught in a child-friendly way, and how do I make them accessible for young people? Because I know them, I know how this works for me as an adult, but maybe that's not the language or the context that a child might understand. So we're kind of gonna dig into that. How do we actually spread queer joy, and how do we do that in a way that is relevant for young people? So, the first way I like to talk about this is kind of like a big core component of what I do, of talking about practicing our pronouns. And there's a very specific question I want to ask you. And that question is, what are your pronouns today? If everybody wants to go in the chat, this is a great time to go in the chat. Let me know what your pronouns are today. I'm seeing she, her, they, she, her, they, them. That's awesome. He, him. Any pronouns. I love that. Uh, and this is amazing because these are what your pronouns are today. They could be different tomorrow. They could be different the next day. They could have been different yesterday. But these are the pronouns that you want for yourself and the words that feel good to you right now. And that's something that I really emphasize when I'm talking to kids about this. First, I mean, we talk about pronouns and what pronouns are, words that we use to replace someone's name when we're talking about them. Very, very simple. This is a simple literacy lesson, right? Like, this is something you might walk into any kindergarten classroom that's practicing their letters, practicing their words, and you'll see them writing out he and him and she and her and they and them. And what we're doing right now is we're introducing this concept of gender, right? We're introducing this concept of gender. And what I like to do is making sure that we're using they and them as normalized pronouns. And even with the beginning of my book, right? The title, even, we're introducing Z and Zer, and we're introducing neo pronouns. So new words that maybe we haven't heard before, and that's okay. We're introducing new ideas, we're introducing new language because you never know when someone's going to hear a word and think, "Oh my goodness, that feels good. That word feels good to me. I want to play with that word. I want to see how that word feels when people use it for me, when people use it around me." Right? How does that word make me feel? And this is really key to helping kids understand this, is attaching words to feelings. How does that word make me feel? And this is how we can use pronouns and words to talk about gender euphoria, because that's really what this picture book is about, right? It's a lesson on pronouns, it's a lesson on gender, but really what it does is attach feeling to these words. Okay, that person used she for me. Did that word feel good when they use that word for me? How can we understand what words we want to use for ourselves if we don't know how they make us feel? Right. So, when we kind of get into this, we're going to see all of these different kinds of people and the kinds of words that we use for themselves. So, he and she and they and z and here and they and per. Raise your hand if you just learned a new word today, right? A new word that you could use for yourself, but someone else in your life could use for themselves, or even a stranger could use for themselves, right? So, this is a really simple, practical concept of, okay, what are your pronouns today? This is a question you can ask anyone when you're filling out a form with a family, right? What are your names? How do you spell that? Oh, what pronouns do you want me to use for you today? Easy as that. It's not a hard question. And that's why I wrote the book in the first place, because it's a tool that you can use, right, to ask that question of a child, but it's also something that they can grab from their own bookshelf and say, "Hey, can you read me this story today? I want to answer that question today." Right? So, we're doing that, we're instigating this conversation, and really this part of like, okay, how, what does this have to do with spreading queer joy? It has to do with this: you can choose your own pronouns, use whichever feels right to you, because the right pronouns feel super cool, totally awesome, amazingly wonderful, just like you. We are attaching joy to the words that we use for ourselves. And that's one way that we can start to spread queer joy, right? We're normalizing these words, different words that we can use for ourselves. Thank you for continuing to share your pronouns in the chat. That's awesome. And we are connecting these words and this language that we use for ourselves to joy and celebration of ourselves, and a little bit of like creativity too. Like, we can answer that question, one way on one day and one day on another day. We don't have to be fixed. And that's something that's so special about children, right? About young people, is that they're still figuring themselves out. They're still figuring out how they fit in the world, what they want to use for themselves, and how they want to move and use language. And we can only figure out who we are in relation to other things when we try them on first. There's a reason why we go into a clothing store and we go into the fitting room with a piece of clothing, because we don't know if it fits before we walk out of the store with it, right? So why can't we treat the way that we think about our identity and ourselves in the same way? I want to try that on. I want to try that on. Oh, that doesn't fit quite right. Maybe there's something else in that section or a different size that I can grab, right? Um, all right. So that's practicing pronouns. That's one kind of practical way we can start spreading queer joy, attaching that joy and that emotion to words that we might use for ourselves. Oh, all right. Now, number 2. This is kind of like the bread and butter of what I do. and I call it venturing under the doorknob. And this is a the silly doorknob from Alice in Wonderland, if you might remember. And this is a phrase that I stole from a professor of mine in undergrad, Philip Dawkins, who is a fantastic playwright. And this was in a class where I was learning how to write plays for young audiences. Children's storytelling and children's theater are really kind of my background and where I started doing all of this work. And Philip told us one day in one of our early classes, okay, so when you're approaching storytelling for children, when you're approaching these topics for young people, I want you to venture under the doorknob. And now I'm not talking about like getting under a door and looking up at the world. I'm talking about getting down to the height of a child and looking up at the world through their perspective. So, what has changed? What changes when you go from 5, 6 feet above the ground to closer to 2, 3 feet off the ground? What does the world look like? How do things look different, right? When you do that physically to your body. So, maybe some things are out of reach and maybe some things are actually closer, right? Maybe some things look bigger and maybe some things look smaller actually, right? Has anybody in here ever gone to a place as an adult that you were in as a child? And it's a very kind of weird feeling that happens, right? You go into this space and things have kind of shifted, right? A lot of the time I find that that space has maybe shrunk. It feels a lot smaller than it did when you were a kid. Again, some things are out of reach. Mismatch, that's a great word for it. Yeah, there's something different because our perspective has changed, right? We're higher off the ground. Exactly. Going to your elementary school. Absolutely. And remembering it being so much bigger. And so I want to think about this as kind of like a metaphor, right? For, okay, how can we approach seemingly complex topics from under the doorknob, getting down to a child's perspective? We're not dumbing anything down. We're just kind of shifting, we're simplifying things. We're looking at what is reachable to a child, what makes sense in their world, what's something that they have exposure to, what's something that they understand. And these kind of four things: fairness, play, family, love. These are things, friendship. What are some other ones? Other kind of ideas that children understand, right? These are ideas that children can grasp. Fairness, absolutely. Play, absolutely. Love, absolutely. Family, absolutely. That's their whole world. Acceptance, I love that. Absolutely. These are ideas that kids get. Safety. Yes, I think sharing is a big one too. And so, what we can do is we can really break down these kind of like big, complex topics that we talk about as adults, and we can break them down into these kind of smaller, more accessible ideas that kids can really grab and understand in kind of their day-to-day life. So how do we talk about sexuality and sexual orientation and who we love and how our families are made up? That's always how I approach LGBTQ plus kind of words and sexuality terminology, right? So how can we explain what gay means? Well, some men maybe love other men, and there are families with two dads, right? And there are families with two women, and people can love each other who are the same gender, right? And that's we've already explained sexuality, right? We can talk about fairness and we can talk about justice and activism, right? How is that person being treated, right? Is that person being treated fairly or unfairly, right? These are ways that we can simplify these complicated adult ideas and really zoom in on the kind of building blocks of these concepts, right? Okay. So that's kind of getting under the doorknob. And one last thing that I'll kind of say with this one, um, we have fairness, play, family, and love, friendship, sharing. I think other people have been kind of putting caring, absolutely, 100%. I actually do a retelling of the Stonewall riots and revolution story as kind of an origin story for the Pride and LGBTQ plus movement as we know it today, and I do it by talking very specifically about the friendship between Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. And they can understand that story and how Marsha and Sylvia were treated unfairly because of who they were and because they wanted to just dance with their best friend, right? And when I get to the part of the story where I'm talking about how the police came in and told them they couldn't dance anymore. And Marsha and Sylvia said, no, we want to dance with our best friends. They get it. Kids get the emotional impact of that story. And that's what matters so much more because we're talking about that fairness. We're talking about justice. We're talking about queer identity and how we're being treated by others. And they can understand the origin of the LGBTQ plus movement today as a story of a beautiful friendship that sparked a movement. And I think something that's important too when we're talking about venturing under the doorknob is that when we're approaching these kind of complex, seemingly kind of complex topics with young people, we have to remember that we as grown-ups, we take all of our lived experience and baggage along with us when we start talking about these ideas. So really, what I want you to do when you get under the doorknob is I want you to get down to their level, but I also want you to take off that backpack, right? I want you to take off that life that I know it's so hard. We get so attached to our life experience, rightfully so. It's our experience. But kids don't approach these topics with all of that lived experience because as, you know, in my 30s, I have 30 plus years of people misgendering me, of walking through the world being perceived as a woman, being perceived as queer, right? And that has positive and negative experiences associated with it. And I think everybody probably has negative and positive experiences of walking through the world, living in their bodies with their gender and their presentation and how people perceive that. But kids, compare my 30 years to a 3-year-old who's only been walking through the world through walking, kid, they haven't even been walking for 3 years, right? They don't develop the musculature yet, right? So they're not coming to this conversation around gender, around the LGBTs, around justice, around fairness, right? With all of that baggage that we have. So it's up to us to take that backpack off for ourselves, leave it at the door, get down to their level, and talk about it in a way that makes sense to what they can grasp in their own lives. Okay, so we have practicing our pronouns. We're going to do that. We're going to attach words to joy and creativity and experimentation. We're going to venture under the doorknob. We're going to take off those backpacks and we're going to approach these ideas from a child's level. And then we're going to curate our resources. We're going to look at the world around us and how are we reflecting the realities of who exists in this world, of who exists in our world, and how we are showing our children and our young people what that world looks like. And so this is really important, especially for young people. I am a huge, maybe I'm biased as an author, but it's so important to have a impeccably curated picture book collection. This is something that I talk about a ton, right? And I'm someone having a great point touching on intersectionality with race, ethnicity, and queerness. So important. We need to make sure that we are showing children that, and this is something that we can do with, I have a queer kid stuff video where I talk about intersectionality at a preschool level, and it is absolutely possible. Intersectionality is not too big of a word for a child. And when we're approaching curation, we need to be thinking intersectionally, right? We want to make sure there are a couple of different things that we want to tick off, right? Especially when we're approaching picture books, but this also goes for graphic novels, for early readers, for novels and fiction, YA, right? This goes for the TV that we're intaking, that we're showing our children, the screen time that they're seeing, whether we're showing them all mainstream, if they're going on YouTube and they're looking at in small indie creators, and we're looking at this through a subject lens too. We can find diversity, that intersectionality, that queerness within our topics of special interest, right? And so very specifically, when I get into picture books, there are a couple of kind of criteria that I really like to kind of talk about. And There's a lot to all of this, and we only have so much time here. But when I approach kind of a picture book collection, there are a couple of things that I want you to be thinking about. And first, really, it's taking a look and seeing, okay, do I have any kind of LGBTQ plus representation in the books that are in my collection on my bookshelf for my child? And that's gonna get you started, right? Like, do you have that representation? Yes or no? And then we're gonna dive into, okay, what does that representation actually look like? Do I have LGBTQ plus families who are depicted in the illustrations? Do I have books that educate on LGBTQ plus and social justice topics? Those are kind of two separate things, right? Do I have books that are also normalizing LGBTQ plus topics? So this is kind of like a nuance here. So we need books that are going to be explicit in educating. So I would say that my picture book, Hooray for She, He, Ze, and They, probably falls a little bit more under the educational category, right? We're talking about pronouns. We're giving a definition around gender. We're talking very specifically about like these are words that we have. These are words that you can use for yourself. It's not necessarily story driven. So that's kind of one side of it. This making sure that we have the educational component that is explicit and is direct, right? We need to have that because kids need to see and be told directly what exists, right? They need to be taught this is education, right? And then we also need to normalize. So we need to have those picture books where a great example is a book called Mr. Watson's Chickens. And it's a story about Mr. Watson, a man who owns chickens and loses his chickens and needs to go looking for them, right? Very cute story for kids, right? Very sweet picture book. But he happens to be gay and he has a husband. But the book isn't about his queerness. The book is not about his husband and him and their relationship. It's not about his queerness. He just is a queer person who's being represented in a picture book about farm animals. But what we need both of these kinds of books because we need the normalizing because that's just true, right? That's the world. We can go about our day and we can see a queer couple at a grocery store just as we see a straight couple at a grocery store, just as we see trans and non-binary and cisgender people at the grocery store, right? These are all people who exist and they're not giving a lesson on like their gender and their pronouns when they're walking through the grocery store. They're just, buying something for dinner, right? They're just being normal people, everyday lives, right? But we also need the educational component. We can't have one of these without the other because if we have the normalized content and we just have that, the world that we live in today doesn't give us enough context. Children need the education because it's not really given elsewhere. That education is not baked into our systems in the way that education around cisness and heterosexuality already is without even thinking about it, right? So we need that educational resource because we want that normalized queer stuff to be legible to children. Again, it needs to be legible. They need to be able to see it and recognize it. Kids who have had that educational resource and have had those spaces where they've been told directly what this is, they will point out uh the most like Tumblr pride flag that you've ever seen because they understand what it means. They understand the symbolism and the iconography if they've only been told it just like a couple of times, right? It is so important that they see that and are told what it is so that they can point it out and recognize it when they see it normalized. Um, Okay, so those are kind of like the biggest things of like when we're curating our resources, do we have these educational components and do we have these kind of normalized versions of that as well? These everyday, run of the mill, kind of mundane representation, right? They're both important. They both have to coincide with each other and both be there. Um, and then a couple of other things, making sure that we're being intersectional in our resources, making sure that looking at all of the authors of your picture books and making sure we have Black queer and trans authors, that we have Indigenous queer and trans authors, that we have Palestinian queer and trans authors, that we have queer and trans authors who are from so many different cultures and spaces, because this is the beautiful thing that I love about queerness, is that it is ubiquitous across race, across nationality, across culture, across religion. There is a queer person or a trans person or a non-binary person, an LGBTQ plus person in every single culture that exists within humanity. And I don't even need research to back that. I just know that that is true because of the nature of who we are as humans, right? And those statistics that we were talking about at the very beginning, 1 in 5 Gen Z youth identify as LGBTQ plus, and those are just people who self-identify, right? So when we're talking about reflecting the LGBTQ plus and queer community within our resources, we're also talking about, okay, how representative is that queerness of the world and the diversity that exists within queer culture and within humanity generally. So we're making sure that that is also a component when we're curating our resources. And then own voices, we're making sure that the authors are, that the queer stories aren't just being told by straight cisgender people as well, because that certainly can be a problem. Absolutely. So yeah, so that's really kind of looking at that through the picture book lens, but those are kind of ways that we can look at across media. Obviously, in preschool and young people's television, there's still a long way to go, but we're working on it. Trust me. All right, so we've practiced our pronouns, we've ventured under the doorknob, and we've curated our resources, and we're and bringing this all back to spreading queer joy. We're making sure that when we're curating our resources, we are looking also at the tone of what they're looking at. How are we centering joy? How are we centering joyful experiences and stories, right? That you can be as intersectional as you want, you can be as, educational and normalized as you want, but if every single picture book that checks all those boxes, if every single picture book has a bullying narrative in it, then it's still not as diversified as we want it to be, because sure, it can be difficult to be a queer person in the world today, but coming out and living as my authentic self has brought me so much joy, and that is so much more a part of my story than any hardship that I've been through, and that's what I wanna talk about when I'm talking to kids, and this is a really important thing when we're talking about LGBTQ plus history as well, of we're not sugarcoating things, right? We're not keeping anything out of the history books. We're not lying to kids, but we want to make sure that the emphasis isn't always on the negative, isn't always on what is hard, because that's just a part of the story, and equating LGBTQ plus experience, right, to bullying and negativity and the hate that comes at us isn't the full story, right? And that's the story that's told over and over and over again. And the way that we combat that, and it's really an information problem, right? The way that we combat that is by centering joy. All right. I think it's time for a little Q&A. Tay, I think, is going to start grabbing some questions.
I am
And while
here.
we're doing that, I'm just gonna stick this up here. I've got my contact information. I do performances and story times and all that good stuff. You can find that on my website, queerkidstuff.com. And I have a quiz if anyone wants to assess where they are in creating LGBTQ plus affirming spaces for the kids in their lives.
Lindz, thank you. Oh my gosh, this is always phenomenal. I love watching you and hearing you speak. It's always phenomenal. That venturing under the doorknob stays with me all the time. So, folks, if you've got questions, please put them in the Q&A box. And if you don't have a question but want to venture in the Q&A box, upvoting is definitely an awesome thing. It helps us know really where the audience is and what they want to hear about. So with that, I want to ask the most upvoted at 22 currently is, what suggestions do you have for those of us working with parents who are against their children's identity? A matter of fact, a lot of other questions
Mhm.
are in the Q&A box that are very similar than this. I know we've talked about this a lot.
Mhm.
So what's your thoughts in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. I get this question a lot. And first of all, I want to take a deep breath, everybody. This is hard. this is a really difficult to be position to be in when you're having to deal with this, and, like, it sucks, and I wanna validate those emotions, and I also want to, like, this is something that I feel like when people come to me with this question, they're feeling like a big burden around it, right? Of like wanting to validate and affirm that child and feeling so and grieving so much for their situation, right? And I wish I, like, had a better answer for this than the one that I that I typically give because, there's so much about living in this world. This sucks, and this is a thing that really sucks, right? But the thing that I usually say to people is, you cannot control that child's home life, right? Like, it is, and it's not up to you to save that child, right? Like, this is such a hard thing, but you cannot take that on. It's not your job, and it's not your job to change their minds, right? Like, they are going to come to that in whatever way I hope they can. If they care about their child's happiness, I hope that they shift their minds, but that burden does not fall on you as an individual, right? What you can do is when you are with that child, when that child is in your space where you have power, you have control, you can affirm the heck out of that child. You can show that child, "These are my values. This is who I am. Who you are is something that I love. I love you for who you are and your authenticity that you are sharing with me, and you are being vulnerable. This is a safe space for you, and I can be that person, and the space that I'm cultivating can be that space for you." And that is where you have power, because you don't have power in that child's home. You don't have power with that child's parents. Those parents, they have the control, they have the power, and they have the power to shut you out of that child's life. That is the thing that you do not want, because you can be that safe person. You can be that safe haven that that child goes to, and that, I know it doesn't feel like that big of a deal, but to that child, that is a huge deal. That you are the person that they are going to remember for the rest of their lives as that person who affirmed and was a safe person for them when they needed it most, when they were in unsafe spaces the rest of their day, right? And I don't know if any of you, like, remember, like, a English teacher or a drama teacher, like, those tend to be the ones, who helped you when you were young, when you were confused, when you were still figuring it out, right? Like, if you remember that teacher, like, you are being that person for that child. And think about that person's impact on you in your life, and think about that impact that you can have on that child. And, that person wasn't necessarily in your home, right? Or changing your parents' minds about something. They were with you, and they were cultivating that safe space with you. And that's what's important here, because I don't want you to get bogged down by the fact that have this. We're sad for that child, right? That sucks. That is a crummy situation, but there's nothing we can do about that. And what I want you to focus on is the stuff that you do have control of, because it makes more impact than you think. There we go. Hopefully that helped, maybe ease a little bit of the burden on some folks, but
Oh,
also
that
give,
was great.
yeah, there we go.
Thank you so much, Lindz.
Of
Um,
course.
I got another question for you, the
Mhm,
second most upvoted, and along similar lines as the first
mhm,
question that you just answered. But a lot of us in our day-to-day work lives, we have to deal with legality, right?
mm,
So as social workers, we may be dealing with case notes. We may be doing insurance forms to
mm,
bill, right? We may also be providing grant data, right? So there's some legalities involved that require us to use
mm,
possibly dead names, possibly wrong pronouns, information that is sort of legal information at the time.
mm,
So the question is sort of that juxtaposition of like, how do you still sort of fulfill that obligation? But how do you ensure again that you are being super affirming and everyone knows like, this isn't me, right? It's not me doing this. I am in your corner, but I have to fulfill this legality. How
mm.
do you kind of walk that line, if you will?
Yeah, it's a tough line to walk. I think, first of all, disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer. I am not at all giving any legal advice. This is all just like anecdotal, especially when you're just like working with a client, right? One on one, when you are working with someone in your space and you are, especially if you're filling out forms, if you're dealing with legal forms, things like that. This is certainly a society that has a lot of, legal hoops that we have to jump through that are accessible to some and not accessible to others when it comes to name and gender markers and birth certificates and passports and all that stuff. Um, my advice on all of this kind of stuff is like take that person's lead. Um, the nice thing of like if you are someone who is dealing with forms and dealing with legalese and dealing with those spaces where you have to be filling out forms and things like you are able to be a barrier for that person, right? Like you can like kind of take the brunt of like how a dead name might feel to a trans person because you can say, "Huh, I see that name and I see this person who has used a different name with me. Okay, this can click in for me right now. We can get on the same page about identity and what words they want to use, and then you can go forward and say, "Huh, I see the wrong name on this form. I'm not going to use that name. I'm going to use the name that you are telling me you want me to use. But I know in the back of my head, okay, this is a name that I have to use on these forms and stuff, but like that's not the word that I'm or the name that I'm going to use with this person when we're sitting down right here." And that is just like the next like it's an extra step. It's kind of like a middle person kind of thing. Like a honestly kind of like a translator, right? Like how a translator might interact with someone through a different language, through our wonderful ASL interpreter today. Shout out to Crystal. um, and how we might translate a name on a form to the name that they want us to use in person, and then the name that aligns with who they are authentically. So it's just like a little bit of like a brain rewiring, but it will make that person so much more comfortable with you. And I know in these kinds of settings, especially like when we're talking about medical professionals and therapists and mental health workers, it is so important that your client or the person that you're working with feels comfortable enough with you to tell you the truth. Right? You want to make sure that you're getting a full history, that you are getting them to open up and be vulnerable in ways that will help them in the long run, and making them feel safe and comfortable by making sure that you're using the correct name and words that they want to use is going to go so far with you being a safe person for them. So it just really takes that little shift. And, we're not perfect. We're humans. We make mistakes. If we make a mistake, correcting it, moving forward, not making a big thing out of it, and just making sure that we're doing better next time, they'll understand, especially if your intention is there and you're working on it. So, yeah, I would just thinking about it as kind of like that translator role. I see that name. I know there's a different name. I'm going to use that name here with this person. I'm going to use this name on the form for legal purposes. There you go.
Absolute fire. Oh my gosh, just dropping knowledge.
I try.
Um, you're doing great. Okay, we've actually got our next question is also coming a lot up in this questions, very similar questions. And Linz, I know you're on the circuit. I know you travel a lot nationally. You're always in different spots doing awesome things. And so a lot of the questions that I'm seeing now is around
Mm,
these anti queer and trans bills that are in a
yeah.
lot of different states. I know ACLU is tracking it. It's
Mhm.
400 plus. And I know that some of these states, those bills are actually passing. They're
Yeah.
not being stopped in circuit court. They're actually being upheld, and people are carrying them through in such states as Florida and Texas.
Yeah.
So I guess these questions are, if you're there, if you live in the state, if you work in a state like that that has these bills that are passing, how do you navigate that? There must be so much fear, right? You could lose your job, you could be investigated by the state. So how would you sort of navigate that balance of being affirming while still knowing that like there's a legality involved here at a state level?
Yeah, this is really tough, and this has been a fun new question that I've had to deal with the last couple of years, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any right answer, which is the thing that sucks about all of this. Um, yeah, this is where it's hard because And every state's also really different too. The ACLU tracks. I would also look at Erin Reed, who's an independent trans reporter. She has a fantastic Substack that goes out. I think you can access most of it for free, but you can also pay for a trans femme person who's doing fantastic independent journalism. Erin Reed is her name again, and she has a really great presence on TikTok and Instagram, but also does just really good reporting and really tracks a lot of this legislation that's happening. So really recommend if you want to kind of stay on top of that, looking at Erin's work. But especially if you're dealing with a very specific state and very specific legislation within that state. Um, yeah, I mean, I think with the legality, especially in schools, this is a big issue. Especially of like thinking about where and who a young person is out. And for me, like if we can like kind of go with that version of the question, which is kind of what I know best and can kind of give the best advice on, is really about like following that child's lead. Where are you comfortable using those words, using that name? Where Okay, what are your pronouns today, and who are you comfortable with me using them with? And this is I've seen kind of like forums that educators have put together online, kind of that have a lot of this. It's really asking consent, right? Like, okay, you're giving me your name, you're giving me your pronouns. Where do I have consent to use them? Right? Are you okay with me using your pronouns in your name with your parents? Are you okay with me using your name and your pronouns with other teachers? Are you okay with me using your name and your pronouns with school administrators? What circles of like outness is it okay for me to talk about this? Because we never want to out a child, right? Like a lot of the legislation has to do with this of like, where is an educator using a child's pronouns that doesn't adhere to their birth sex, right? And all it really is like legislating outing when it comes down to it, which is horrible. It's awful, right? Like that's not the place where we want to be. And it takes advocacy to get rid of these laws. It takes, I mean, I know a lot of families with trans kids, especially that have moved states entirely because of a lot of this legislation and lack of access to gender affirming care. And that's a huge part of this too. But I think these are conversations to have, if the parents are affirming, especially having conversations with the parents, um, knowing who in your community are unsafe people, right? Like that's a big part of it of like, okay, who are other allies? Who are other people who I can use this child's words with that they're giving me consent to use? And really just like, at the end of the day, safety is like the biggest concern when it comes to this, your safety, but also the child's safety and that family's safety. So this is just like a huge extra component we have to think about when we're working with trans and non-binary and queer young people. But it's just kind of like the reality of the situation here in the United States right now. And it's really just like about having those conversations if you're talking to a young person who is going through a transition or is experimenting with their words or is, I don't know, doing anything else, is discovering their queerness in any way. And I would really just take it cautiously. Safety is really the utmost concern here, and making sure that you are safe first and foremost, and that family is safe, and that child is safe. And ultimately, at the end of the day, that does kind of usurp, I would say, like being affirming 100%, because what you're actually doing is affirming that child's consent and that child's safety, right? Like, I wouldn't consider a child giving you consent to use their gender assigned aligned pronouns when they want to use like they them pronouns or something. If they present as more femme and you but they use sorry, articulating this. A child who uses they them pronouns and identifies as non-binary but is generally perceived as she her as femme as feminine. Um they've given you consent, if they've given you consent to use she, her pronouns for them with other people outside of their circles, that is affirming them and affirming the information that they've told you that they want to keep them safe. And that is respecting them and their wishes because they also want to remain safe and be able to access the things that they can access by moving through the world in the way that they want to. Um, that's like a complicated answer. Was that helpful?
Oh my gosh, so
Okay.
so complicated. I found it helpful.
Okay, good.
These are big questions. These are big
Mhm.
concepts, and if there was a
And there's
simple
no one
answer,
answer. Yeah.
yeah, we would have done it. We are so much at time. So, Liz, let me just thank you so much. This was brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. So appreciate you. It's amazing to see you. Folks, please fill out the survey. You can find that in the sort of reception area. You fill it out for the full day. And Ashley, I think you wanted to jump in here with some things, so I will invite you into the space.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lindz. Thank you, Tay. And like in the last keynote, we have some visual summary notes that we want to share with you all and to take all of this wonderful information in. Remember, these notes will be available in the booth. We're also going to share it on our website. We encourage you to download, print, share, distribute these visuals so that you can always remember the lessons that we learned today and the information that we share with each other today. I'm going to be quiet for a second so that we can all take in these beautiful, lovely notes.
This is so cool.
Right? Shout out to Yen. Yen is amazing. To you, Lindz. You're amazing.
Aw, thanks for having me. This has been awesome.
Awesome. Fantastic. Again, these will be available. We encourage you to download and share. And thank you again, Lindz. So we're not done yet, y'all. There's still more to come. We're going to take a brief 15-minute break, and then we are going to open up our networking lounge that is featuring peer support specialists from across the country. So if you are a peer support specialist yourself and you want to share, if you want to learn more about what peer support specialist is and what it looks like, whether that's from a young adult perspective or from a family peer support perspective, we are going to have just a full list of a full range of peer support specialists there. Also, we will have a peer support specialist table that will be hosted in Spanish. So Janet Martinez and Monica Ruiz will be facilitating a peer support specialist table in Spanish. So we will start at 4:45. We're going to shift the schedule just a bit. 4:45 Eastern, so that's my time. And so give us a few minutes to set up. At 4:45 Eastern, I will make a live announcement. And in order to get to the networking lounge tables on the reception page, there's a circle on this reception page at the top that says networking lounge. You click that circle and it will take you to 7 different tables that you can choose from. You can navigate all 7. Maybe you just want to visit one. It's really open to you what you'd like to do. So again, we're going to take a quick 15-minute break, and I will give you all an announcement once the networking lounge is open. Thanks so much for joining us.